Hello, everyone. We're back. And I guess the topic of today's episode is, well, we're driving up to see Jordan Peterson up in Grand Rapids. Yielded lots of great discussions. Peterson's event was pretty excellent as well. We're going to outline it.
Yeah, no, for sure. So Peterson is doing a lecture tour right now, and I think he's basically going across America. So he had an event in GR on Tuesday that you, Jordan, I, and Rachel went to, and then also my father, Jeff, went. And kind of last minute, but he's pretty interested in Peterson, I'd say. So, But no, it was an incredible event, and what was kind of interesting, and you already alluded to it, was the fact that in the car ride up to the event, we drove with Jeff. Jordan drove separate. We basically foreshadowed like multiple of the things that Peterson specifically talked about. It was just kind of crazy because we were sitting there during the event and we're like kind of dumbstruck on the fact that so much of our conversations in the car ride were echoed by Peterson in terms of what he chose to talk about, specifically at the beginning of his lecture. So I thought that was pretty funny. I don't know about you. That was pretty funny.
I was sitting in there listening, and we kept looking at each other like,
wow, you gotta be kidding me.
The foreshadowing. But yeah, it was kind of awesome. And so, let's see.
Well, let's talk about the foreshadowing.
Let's talk about it. So, I remember Jeff was asking questions like usual, and then I asked him a question about his denomination switch, or not switch, but the defending of why he is the way he is denomination-wise, or I forget how it works.
Sure, I can quick explain it. So actually, this is fairly relevant. So right now, the Reformed Church of America, which is my father's, the Bridge Church denomination, I believe still technically right now currently, is going through a split over the affirmation of gay marriage. Specifically is the main issue at hand. There's the broader context of the LGBTQ issue as well, but specifically the issue is whether or not as a church we're going to say that gay marriage is biblically ordained. Not that people can't be gay, not that being gay is a sin, nothing like that. And I don't want to get into the weeds on that right now because that's a very complicated and nuanced topic. But the split is happening over whether or not the church can actually affirm gay marriage under the Bible and claim that the Bible supports it biblically. And again, I don't want to do a disservice to the issue because it is very complicated. But basically, my father is the classis leader of like 25, 30 churches in Kalamazoo area, in the greater Kalamazoo area, that are Reformed Church of American denomination. And he is intending to leave the Reformed Church of America, along with another 15 or so churches in the area. And they're going to actually go down to a different, like, it's kind of confusing how it works, but a different denomination that's in Indiana, and I honestly don't even know what it's called. I can't remember.
New Kingdom?
Yeah, that's what it is. Thank you. And it's an interesting thing. They just did a series at the church extensively on the issue, why they're switching, talked extensively about basically anything within the realm of LGBTQ.
Or sexual dimension in general.
Yep, sexual dimension. So
it's on YouTube. Check them out, honestly.
Yeah.
They're really good.
They're pretty good. Jeff does a good job. He's been doing it a while.
Yeah.
He's old and wise.
I'll put him in the description.
There you go. So we're almost done. Basically, so that's the issue, and you asked him about it, and it prompted
him saying, well, some churches aren't willing to say that the LGBTQ isn't biblical, and he's willing to say that it is, and he's like, I gotta take a stand on it, and I'm like,
whoa, you just mixed that up. He's willing to say that it isn't biblical.
Yeah.
Did you say that right?
I think so.
Okay, I just want to make sure because this is important.
Yeah.
This is an important distinction. My father is on this side, believes that you cannot read into the Bible gay marriage affirmation, essentially, is one way to put it. He believes that is not supported biblically. Sorry. Keep going. I just want to clarify. Yeah. I could have misheard you, but keep going.
And so it just sparked some thoughts. And I remember Nate mentioned something about the justice. I forget her name.
Yeah, so Ketanji Brown. Hopefully I pronounced her first name right. Yeah, we could get into that. Mm-hmm. That one's crazy. And as Peterson said, insane. So, so right now, for those of you who aren't aware, just I think it was like 2 days ago or 3 days ago, Ketanji Brown just got nominated to the Supreme Court, and she's the newest justice. And after the regular Senate hearings and congressional hearings where they grill her about her judicial past, which is mostly just for political, what would be the word, posturing. It's just kind of an act. But there were some interesting questions asked and some serious questions about her past judicial cases, specifically surrounding one topic, which is where she would have lenient sentencing towards people that produced or watched child porn. And that's a whole other issue. We don't even need to go into that. But the reason that she got brought up was because I actually asked my father if he had heard about this, and he hadn't, which I thought was crazy, frankly. Because Ketanji Brown was asked by, I don't remember her name, some congresswoman, well, can you provide a definition for the word woman? And she said, no, I can't. And then tried to justify it by saying she wasn't a biologist, which, of course, if I had been asking the question, I would have immediately asked, well, are you a woman? And then when she said yes, I would ask, well, how do you know that? But unfortunately, they didn't go down that logical rabbit hole. So it was an astounding statement, truly, for a number of reasons. One is basic biology is not something that you need to be a biologist about. And when 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds know the difference between a man and a woman and know that there are differences, and you as a Supreme Court justice don't, hypothetically, that's a pretty big deal. Now, here's the deal, though, is of course she knows the difference between men and women. But the only logical conclusion from an answer like that is that she's so ensconced and concerned with, that's not even the right phraseology. So ensconced is probably just the best way to put it, with leftist modern ideology surrounding gender and sex, that she's literally too nervous to explain the basic differences of biology between men and women. Which is astounding that a Supreme Court justice would refuse to do so. I mean, it's just astounding. Yep. And frankly insane. And more evidence of the fact that we're living in a absolutely preposterously crazy time. So I brought that up, and he couldn't believe it and was shocked by it. And then Peterson happened to talk about that very issue, which, I mean, I guess isn't that big of a coincidence, but it's kind of crazy, during the talk. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to add to that. Yeah. It was crazy.
It kind of led to a discussion about what's her name?
Abigail Schreier.
Thank you. And the transgender craze that's seducing our young daughters. It's a book. Yeah. I haven't even fully read it, but I've heard podcasts about it. But it kind of sparked that because there's adults telling children that sex and gender are, or if you want to change your sex, go ahead, surgically do it, put hormones, castrate yourself, and it terrifies me a little bit. So it was just like, that was brought up, and it's because there's so much gender ideology going around right now, and it's infesting even school places and with children who don't even understand what most of the sexual dimension is until puberty or later. So it's like,
got sparked that discussion.
Exactly.
But I don't know if you have more to add.
Yeah, we can now talk about the Peterson event.
Oh, I wanted to talk about Albacore Shrine.
Oh, thank you.
Well, we're not going to Peterson yet. I'm just getting started. I got wine in my system. Are you kidding me? Okay, so Abigail Shrier, right? She writes this book. Oh, I'm definitely going to get some hate for this.
Yeah,
Oh, it's going to be fun. So she writes this book with a, on a highly controversial topic. I mean, just read her title, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. I mean, So she gets banned from, I think it was Walmart or Target or something like that after she publishes the book. I actually read the whole book. She's also been on Joe Rogan, and she's been on Peterson's podcast, both of which are, if you don't want to read the whole book, although it is a really good book, both of which are just excellent summaries of, her book and what she does. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, do it.
Because it's just some of the things are just crazy to me. So basically, what she outlines is the infestation of, let's call it, leftist gender ideology in young teenage women, specifically. She talks about teenage boys, and obviously it's broader than that, but specifically teenage women. And the reason that she hyper-focuses on teenage women is because historically, transgenderism has been much more common in young boys, according to the historical record. And what is weird is what's going on right now is, the opposite of what happened in the past, where young boys would be confused about things. Now it's young women. And what's interesting is it's not just one young woman, or one. I can't even speak. One woman. It's her and all of her friends. And they all do it within a very short time period and claim, come out as transgender. And she talks about this as a social contagion and, puts evidence forth and whatnot. The UK stat is that there's been a 4,000% increase in transgender teenage women, which, if you know anything about statistics or anything about reality at all, that's not normal. So
exactly. I have one suspicion on one of the factors of why it's such a huge increase.
Yeah.
Social media.
Oh, yeah.
You go on to your social media app, and it's promoted as if switching genders or being transgender is a good thing for your future self, for your present self, for the people around you. And it's like, just do some thinking for a minute before you think that's the best thing, especially if you're young and your brain hasn't even fully developed. That's kind of the case I'm wanting to make. Maybe once you're 20 or something and you're like, man, I really think it would be better, then I'd say maybe if that's your choice. But when you're telling children that, if you feel you're this way, then you probably are, and you're affirming, it's the opposite of what the psychological literature says to do to people who feel one thing that isn't true. And if you just affirm someone the whole time, it's not going to help them.
Yeah, and the basis of psychotherapy essentially is questioning the person's assumptions, is questioning the conclusions that they've come to. And right now, and you didn't actually mention it, but right now, the American Psychological Association has put under the category of conversion therapy the transgender subject, let's claim. So they outlawed conversion therapy, which for some good reasons too, and there was whole clinics that would pray the gay away, and there's definitely some danger in that, let's say, to put it lightly, but they've put under that umbrella this transgender issue, which quite literally means that a psychologist, if a young girl comes to them at the age of 13 and says they're transgender, the psychologist is not allowed to question that person's assumptions. They're not allowed to, legally.
Not allowed to tell the parents.
Which is crazy. It goes against, a number of things. One, reality. Two, it goes against psychotherapy entirely, which is based upon, trying to find reality, and what is actually reasonable and what's true, which they can't do. So, yeah, that's completely insane. So she talks about that. The book is incredible. The podcasts are incredible. We could only just start to touch on the issue. We should just do a whole podcast on the issue because we're going to get mired down here. So I'm going to try and make a couple conclusion statements, and if you want to use it, you can too. So we got onto that topic because of the Ketanji Brown situation and the fact that her answer to such a basic question was evidence of her enthrallment and ensconcement, if that's a word, with leftist ideology. And then we talked about how that's infected the schools, and Abigail Schreier has talked about the specific issue of transgenderism, and you know the fact that basic reality, truth-based assertions about evolutionary biology are no longer allowed to be said, all of those things. And as you said earlier, there's a huge distinction between adults wanting to pursue, let's just call it, conversions into the opposite sex, and children. Children are not capable of making decisions about things that they do not understand, such as sex. They aren't capable of doing so. So to encourage them to do so is a dereliction of your duty as a responsible adult to a deep, deep degree. So read the book, listen to the podcasts, but we got on that topic because of the insanity of the Ketanji Brown answer. And to bring it to the Peterson event, that was specifically touched on. So, I don't know if you have any more conclusion.
Well, one more thing.
Yeah.
If you're debating going through the surgery to switch your gender, just be aware that you will no longer be fertile.
Yeah, there's a good chance that for women, you will lose the ability to bear children. And making that decision at 16, oh man, dude.
It's something you really should debate a lot longer.
You should spend
until you're
months thinking about that. So.
So yeah, that's I guess the final thought I have on that. But
sure. Yeah. No, we're definitely gonna do a whole podcast on that because it's too complicated to touch here. And our main objective was actually to talk about Peterson. Yeah. I don't want to. I don't want to run out of brain before we get there.
Yeah. So it was a good overview.
Yeah. So anyway. Crazy car ride in terms of foreshadowing, because then Peterson immediately jumped into
Ukraine, Russia. I think that was his first point, or maybe
not. No, it was Ukraine and Russia, and we talked about that in the car to a decent degree. But then he talked specifically about the ideological differences between the Soviet Union, Russia now, the old Soviet Union. He talked about specifically, post World War II, when the Iron Curtain, fell across Europe, which essentially was a both physical barrier between East and West Germany and a ideological barrier between Soviet communism and Western democracy. And for the state of the entire Cold War, essentially from the end of World War II till the collapse of the Soviet Union in
1989.
I think it's 1989, something like that. That was the reality on the ground, and how we're seeing almost a new version of that to a certain extent. And he talked about the ideological differences between the West and, let's call it the East, the Soviet Union, and China specifically. And how Putin, whatever you think about him, thinks we've lost our minds. And whatever you want to say about Putin, on that particular issue of being incapable of answering a question like, what is a woman? I think he happens to be right. So that was what he talked about, and I just remember us sitting there being like, that's just crazy that we had just talked about this. So anyway, maybe it's not that big of a deal, but when you had to be there, okay? It was kind of cool. It was kind of crazy. So
yeah.
I don't know if you have anything to add, and we get to what he actually talked about.
He said in that dimension, he's like, it's almost like it's sure, we're facing Russia, but it's almost like it's a civil war in the sense of there's conflicting ideologies in America in some sense. Do you remember he made that distinction where it's like or he just made that point, and he said like the polarization slash some people are very confused about sex and gender, and some people aren't, and he just feels like there's such a it's almost like we're fighting with each other instead of trying to face Putin. I think he made a point somewhat like that.
Yeah, no, he did. It was, I'll admit, it was kind of a confusing point.
Yeah.
I didn't fully get where he was going with it. But no, he did certainly talk about the internal strife and struggle in our own nation / the West, let's call it, and the fact that we couldn't actually even decide upon what was true, and how that was fueling this, and then the ideological differences between the West and the East, and he went into that. And I think all of those are good points to consider, for sure. So, yeah.
Yep.
And then he actually got into his lecture,
yep.
which, I don't know, if you listen to Peterson long enough, he does an incredible job of talking about things at the beginning of an hour-and-a-half long lecture that you think, how in the hell is this going to relate to his final point? And then somehow he weaves it all together. And sure enough, that was demonstrated, I'd say, again. And even the foreshadowing of the Ukraine conflict with Russia and him talking about the ideological differences was foreshadowed to a certain degree towards what he eventually answered on, more or less. But I don't know, do you want me to talk about how he started the lecture, or do you want to go into it?
I think after all that, he started talking about the rule that he was going to talk about, which is Rule 12 of his 12 More Rules for Life, which is...
Second book, Beyond Order.
It's be grateful in spite of your suffering. And it's a pretty good rule in general. It's very useful. I fall victim to not being grateful all the time. It's tough sometimes. You don't realize how good you have it and how many things you should be grateful for. But that's just a summary. But so Peterson, how does he start this lecture? I'm trying to remember.
He talked about he talked about a number of things, all of which we could do entire podcasts on. He talked specifically about the origins of the Bible.
Yep.
And then also how the Bible was both literally and psychologically and religiously all the first book that came into being. And I probably didn't say that quite right, but literally the Bible was the first written book. And he talked about how from that, all literature written afterwards had some connection to the Bible, in a sense. And I'm doing it a disservice because he laid out his argument.
It's like it's all
quite well.
Alliterates back to the Bible. Is that the right word?
Say it again.
It's all alluding from the Bible. Alluding to the Bible, or is that alliterating? I forget what the word is. But in the sense of the Bible is kind of the root, and then all other stories branch off
like a tree.
The archetypal main message is almost brought out into pretty much any story.
And how he got on that topic was he was talking about the nature of truth and how his conception, and rather our culture's conception of truth, is, what's the word? Messed up right now. And he specifically talked about the power of stories as being foundational truth, and that he has a disagreement with someone like Sam Harris, who's a famous atheist who he's debated on a number of occasions about what's truly bedrock in terms of truth. Is it the objective world of facts, or is it something more in the value dimension or in the religious dimension? And Peterson makes the case that our perceptual structures are actually biologically wired and structured such that without a story, value-based perception of the world, we're incapable of actually deriving meaning from facts that we observe. And this goes all the way back to David Hume and the famous line that you can't derive an ought from an is, and that's an immensely complicated topic, and I don't have the brain to get into it right now.
One thing
Okay, go.
I could say,
Sure.
The reason he might say that is because if you're trying to look at the world through only facts, there's an infinite amount of facts almost, or
Yes.
almost infinite, and it's hard to know what to believe about each fact and which one is the most important to focus on. And
Yeah, how do you rank them?
The hierarchy, you can kind of tell, but it's almost impossible to go through all of them. And if you have that story / motivations from, well, understanding these deep stories and how acting out what is true is what's going to propel you forward, I think.
Sure. If you don't have the perceptual framework in terms of morality, in terms of values, in terms of, let's call it your why, the set of facts doesn't actually mean anything. And, someone like Sam Harris would disagree with him on this. But that was essentially the case he was making. And he's made that case on multiple occasions, specifically in his book, Maps of Meaning, which is his first book, which I attempted to read and got only part way because I was so dumbstruck by my own stupidity. So, basically, sorry, that was just funny.
Yeah.
But, no, so he makes the case for this, the importance of the story, the importance of the value dimension in terms of structuring your perceptions about reality as such, and talks about how the Bible, he believes, was the first attempt, let's say, at articulating in a written form the fundamental stories that drive our culture. And I agree, mostly. Some nuances in there. But I think he makes a good case, and then he talked about how that is the foundation for basically all literature, in a sense, and Shakespeare makes references to the Bible, and then what branches off from Shakespeare, lots of literature talks about Shakespeare and has been derived from some Shakespearean thought, and etc. So, quite the complicated argument, but overall, I think he made a good point. So
yeah, and it's like the core motifs are almost timeless. The morals and the root stories. Yeah, and so then he dived into Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, which are two of the most root stories, or they go back so far that it's hard to tell how far back they go, but they're integral to our life in almost. So
yeah, they speak about the most foundational things possible, in my opinion. And yet again, I appeal to ignorance and the fact that both of them can have their own podcast. But let's try and dive into them a little bit, while we're here. So from his case that he made about stories, perceptions, values, the fact that the Bible in some sense is the most foundational story, all of which we just summarized, he jumped into a story. He touched on Adam and Eve first, and then he went into Cain and Abel. And when he talked about Adam and Eve, first let's take one step back. Sure. Let's make the quick distinction between literal and pragmatic truth. We've done this before. Yeah. A lot of people look at Genesis in the Bible as somehow a scientific document or trying to tell you the order by which God scientifically made the world. And I think that's a complete misreading.
It's almost like if they're studying it as if it's a history lesson.
Yeah.
Remember the order of events remember the genealogy, and it's
missing the point.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, is you can't read story-based literature as if it's an eyewitness account. You can't read apocalyptic literature like Revelation as a literal scientific document. That's an incorrect way to look at that. So it goes back to this idea of pragmatic truth, which is essentially, well, what story or what can you derive from something that is useful? And, well, what are the stories in Genesis? Well, they're attempting to answer the most fundamental questions that humans have. How do we get here? What is consciousness? How did it emerge into the world? And what's the proper mode forward to make the proper sacrifices to prepare for the future and follow the straight and narrow path? And that is a horribly crude summary of the depth that these stories go to. And Adam and Eve, specifically, is, in my opinion, the collective attempt to understand in written form the emergence of consciousness into the world. And as he's talking about it, he outlines the fact that, when Eve and Adam ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, several fundamental cataclysmic shifts happened in the structure of reality. And one of those was death entered the world, which, well, it's rather rough. Another was that they realized that they were naked, which generally has a sexual connotation, and it's not that that isn't useful, but I don't think that's the primary point here. And Peterson uses the example of, like, when you're in front of a crowd and let's say you're naked, it's less God help you, it's less about the fact that you're naked, and it's more the fact that you're overwhelmed by your vulnerability. So he talked about that specifically, and I think that is the primary point of the fact that you realize you're naked, is you realize you're vulnerable.
You have limitations.
You have limitations.
You're gonna die.
You're a limited being. Death has entered the world. And then on top of that, you know it. You're conscious of it. You know you're vulnerable. You know you're going to die. You know that the future exists as such. And this is where it gets dark. There's a reason it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because if you know how you're vulnerable and how you can be hurt, you know how someone else can be hurt. And that's a fundamental distinction between us and animals. When a lion's hungry and kills a zebra and eats it, it's not an evil act. The lion's just hungry. He's just following his biological urges. There's no conscious malevolence involved in this act. But humans are capable of all sorts of conscious malevolence. We're capable of all sorts of evil things, and all you have to do is read about history, specifically in the 20th century, to understand just the depths to which that goes.
Gulag Archipelago being one.
That's a good book.
Ordinary Men.
Ordinary Men is a good book.
Man's Search of Meaning.
Just keep spitting them out here. No, for sure. So it's a fundamental distinction between humans and animals, and Adam and Eve attempts to articulate that in story form. And then there's more I could say about that, but we'll leave it there for now. And then the next story is Cain and Abel. I don't know if you want to talk about Adam and Eve a little bit. I'm sure you got some 2 cents.
Yeah, I feel like some people view Adam and Eve as if those are the first 2 people. We all literally descended from them. And that's kind of the moral of the story. You obey God, don't eat the apple, obey him and follow him.
Yeah.
That's the kind of the moral I got when I was learning it before. Because I was reading it as a literal story of history. And reading it in this way has completely opened my eyes to the deepness and complexity and how integral it is to your every action in life. And so it was very beautiful that he could even just, when he mentioned that he was going to start talking about Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve, my heart soared, because I was like, these are deep stories that have impacted me in ways that I can't even fully describe.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it was good. And Cain and Abel is my absolute favorite, I think.
Yeah.
It and we can dive into that next, which Cain and Abel are Adam and Eve's two sons, and instead of it just being a genealogy lesson, no, I can't straw man, but it dives into the two paths you could go down when it comes to being grateful for your life, putting proper sacrifices, thinking of yourself and of others, not just presently, but in the future as well. And
no, for sure.
So that's the brief overview, and if you want to talk about it.
Sure. No, I can. So Cain and Abel, it's difficult to even scratch the surface of just how deep this story goes. When I first, let's say, I don't know, recognized the depth to which this could be applied to both my life and people in general, I was irrevocably, I think I said that right, changed psychophysiologically. And I was never able to look at the story in the same light again, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a good thing. But it's also a very intense and stressful thing, let's say. The story hits for me at a fundamental level that can only be truly explored by looking into the depths of human malevolence. And before we go there, if we dare, how about we talk about the basic summary of the story itself?
So I guess the story would be, there's two brothers, and Abel and Cain. And Abel, I think, is the younger brother, but I don't know. Cain is the oldest, I think, but I'm not sure. Either way, the sacrifices that Abel is giving to God, the burning and putting up for God, are pleasing God, and his life is going well. And over here, Cain is putting up sacrifices, maybe not the best, and he's kind of taking shortcuts, possibly, and God isn't that pleased with his sacrifices. Cain looks over at Abel and sees that pretty much anything Abel touches turns to gold, which means that, like, he's putting his heart into life and things are going his way because he's putting as much effort as he can. And Cain over here is like, I resent him so much. I want to be him. I wish things were going that way. So then he looks up and he says, God, why did you design a reality that is so biased against me and so favorable to Abel, and screw you?
Yeah,
in some sense.
His conclusion to the fact that his life is not going well is to question the very structure of reality that God has made. Which is quite the conclusion. It's quite the arrogant conclusion, in fact. And you touched on the fact that they were both making sacrifices, which is it's something that I don't think we, as 21st century Westerners, fully appreciate or understand. And I think there's a fitting reason that the story of Cain and Abel came after Adam and Eve, because Adam and Eve largely revolves around the emergence of consciousness. And the emergence of consciousness means that you know that there's a future, and you know that you have to prepare for that future. And you know that you have to sacrifice things now in the present so that your future self will be better off. And Cain and Abel are creatively and artistically acting that out, essentially, is one way to put it. Don't get me wrong, it's a bit crude, it's a bit archaic, but the idea is that you offer up the best of what you can possibly manage now so that you are better off in the future. And that's essentially this idea of sacrificing. And what's interesting is that, Abel is said to offer up good sacrifices, and Cain is said to offer up there's an ambivalent element. It isn't entirely clear, but there's an implicit assumption that they aren't the best of what he could offer. And due to the fact that his life is not going as well as he would like, he gets resentful, jealous, more arrogant, etc. And what he fails to do is to question if he is the cause of his current predicament. And he's convinced himself that he isn't. He's convinced himself that it's the structure of reality, and essentially that what that's what it means when you question God, in a sense. And I think that's what the story is trying to get at. That he questioned God. He questioned the structure of reality. He said, "What's going on here? Abel is your darling, and everything's going well for him, and here I am suffering and struggling and can't seem to catch a break, essentially." And God tells him the exact thing he doesn't want to hear. And it's something like, sin crouches at the door like a predatory cat. And you've let it in. You've let it have its way with you in a creative way, in a dark way, in the sense that you have knowingly given up moral truth and descended into a malevolent, resentful, and jealous attitude, refusing to accept responsibility for the actions that you did or did not take. And that's exactly what Cain does not want to hear, because his entire perception is based upon the idea that life is fundamentally unfair and he's not to blame. So it's exactly the thing he doesn't want to hear. And you would think that if, the creator of the world, hypothetically, told you, "Hey there, bucko, you might want to double check to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward and that the problem isn't actually your fault," you would think that you should go, sit for a year and meditate on that and repent for the ways that you've failed and erred. But he doesn't do that. He actually decides to kill Abel. And what's so interesting about that is that, Abel is his ideal. It's what he should be doing, so he decides to kill his ideal. And when you do that, you no longer have a direction in life. You no longer know what to do. You're directionless. That's what's so tricky about specifying goals, because the second you specify goals, you specify the ways at which you could fail to meet those goals. So one way is to simply criticize the goal as such, criticize actually going towards it as such. And he takes it to the next level by actually killing Abel, to actually destroy his own ideal.
How's he going to aim now?
What's he going to aim at? And naturally it wrecks him to his core. And if you think long and hard enough about that story, and you think, what exactly was motivating Cain? What exactly were the elements of his consciousness and the modes of thinking and the modes of acting that pushed him to degenerate into such a state that he would engage in an evil act against his own brother? When you think about that long enough, you think about what was his fundamental attitude towards existence. It's the exact same attitude that the Columbine killers had. It's the exact same attitude that the Nazi prison guard had. It's the exact same attitude that the Gulag officer of a particular camp had. When you allow yourself to become taken over by resentment and jealousy and malevolence, you invite in something that's no longer you, it's just pure evil. And the things that people have done when they go down that particular mode of thinking is evidence enough that whatever's down there, whatever mode of being that led you towards those acts, to that way of thinking, is wrong fundamentally. And as we touched on in Wrestling with God, there's a place to put your foot in the ground and say that's wrong. And that story, what's so terrifying about it is that it's within us all. We all have that decision. Do we curse being? Do we curse God? Do we curse existence itself for our current situation? Do we say it would be better if there was nothing instead of something? Do we become resentful? Do we become malevolent? Do we embrace that? Or do we take the opposite approach? And do we accept the responsibility of existence itself? And do we choose to, regardless of our situation, regardless of the injustices that we think have been levied against us, do we choose to be grateful and approach life with our best foot forward, and to speak the truth and to act nobly and follow the straight and narrow path? And that's the fundamental psychological, religious level decision that we all have. And what should motivate you to think about that more seriously is this story, but more specifically, the evidence of this story and the decisions some people made in the 20th century. And all the books that you listed detail that terrifyingly well. This isn't a game. This isn't some nice story that Genesis details. This is the fundamental decision that each of us have each and every moment of our lives about how we approach life as such. And the consequences for not being absolutely certain upon which path you want to go down is that when catastrophe strikes, you will embrace the evil, and you will not be the kind of person that can stand up for what is true and what is good. And all you have to do is read about the 20th century for a very short period of time, and you realize very, very, very quickly that we do not want to go down some of those roads. And we all have that decision. And I think that's what he was trying to get at. Of course, he did it about 10 times better than I did, but let me say one more thing.
Mm-hmm.
What was so interesting about the fact that we got to see him talk about those two stories specifically, and Cain and Abel, which has changed me forever, is that if I had to identify the most influential set of, or the most influential thoughts and psychological perceptions, let's say, that Peterson, religious level perceptions, not just psychological, that Peterson has articulated to me, it would be exactly that. So to actually get to go see him talk about the very thing that changed my life in such a insane way, and took me from going down a extremely, well, the potential for an extremely dark path. Well, I still have that potential, but the high likelihood of a darker path to what I hope is a better path now, simply cannot be articulated how significant that was for me. And I know you feel the same. So there's my long monologue, but I felt like it was needed. So I assume you have some things to add.
Yeah. His unpacking of the biblical stories. It's like he goes through maybe like 5 verses.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that like 4 or 5, 6 verses?
Cain and Abel's like 5 or 6. It's
exactly.
It's not many. Adam and Eve's a little longer.
Sure.
But still, it's not that long.
And it's like
it's the first 2 chapters.
It showed me the complexity and the importance of the story, because it just showed me so much. Showed me how to think about it differently and how to let it impact my life positively. And I guess the message of his rule, tying it back in with the story, it's like, okay, a fundamental precondition is life is suffering. And the instant I heard that, I was like, okay, so that's how this works.
Correct.
Okay, that's just a reality we're going to have to face. Okay, and it almost was optimistic, because sometimes I run into people and they'd say, oh, life is just so excellent, so amazing, or I don't know, they're just incredibly happy.
Life is a constant blessing.
And that's true.
Yes.
Which is...
But it misses part of the story.
A deep part of the story, which is you are going to face hardship, tragedy, death, all kinds of things in your life. And being prepared for and being aware of that, I feel like makes you a more grounded person in general. And so knowing that you're going to face things that are going to knock you down, it's like you're going to have to be very grateful for the things that you have in your life that are going well. And without that, you're going to fall into that pit of hell on earth that Cain fell into. And you see people around you fall into that pit. And so learning to not take for granted what you have and saying that you love them to the people around you, because you never know when tragedy will strike.
You don't.
And when life smacks you, it's like you have 2 options. You can get resentful, angry, pissed off, or you can say, well, it's how life works, and I can improve this situation if I move forward. And it's like, and I'm thankful that I'm still thankful for things. It's so tough, I feel like, for all of us to always be grateful when life has got you down. But it's so important. It sounds so cliche, be grateful. It's like, you hear that all the time. Say thanks. It's like, bro, you don't know how quick the flip can switch to, oh, I don't have any electricity. Oh, my country is descending into chaos and I'm being arrested for something that I didn't even do just because of the color of my skin in my class. Just like the Soviet Union explains. And it's like, we have it so good that people are arguing about gender identity, and they're saying that people are so oppressed, and there's just not gratitude that there needs to be, because this is one of the best time and places we've ever lived in. And I see people with this still Cain-like attitude towards life, where it's like, oh, nothing's going my way, I'm going to complain about everything, oh, it's all other people's fault, oh, but I'm the smartest person I know, and all of this. Yeah. And you're like, oh, that's going to lead you to dark, dark things that you didn't even imagine. And so, being grateful, even if your shit is hitting the fan, being grateful, taking a step back, and thanking God in some sense that you still have opportunities to improve and grow, and life will still continue. And so it's so important. And so it's like you might see Peterson's rule and be like, be grateful in spite of your suffering. And you're like, that's obvious. I've heard that 1,000 times.
Sure.
I don't care. Or like you might, and it's like,
dismiss it.
Oh yeah, okay, I'll be grateful. And it's like, okay, now we're going to dive into the complexity and how these stories that withstand the test of time are built into us in some sense, and looking into them can really make you understand why being grateful is so important, and why taking the attitude of Cain, where it's like, it is my fault, I can get better, it's not God's fault, it's just because I wasn't putting up the proper sacrifice. I can do better. I know I can. That kind of attitude.
The opposite attitude of Cain. But yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what you said, but yeah.
So
no, exactly.
Yeah, it was just a incredible lecture. I couldn't have asked for a better lecture, honestly.
Seriously, it was surreal. The level to which, just to explain to the audience how insane you and I both are.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about you. I've probably listened to more than you have, but not that that's particularly relevant. But I mean, I've listened to literally thousands of hours of this man's content, starting 5-6 years ago. So to actually see him in person was, and then to have the lecture be about, in my opinion, the single most fundamental thing that he shifted my mindset on, and that has changed my life. I mean, come on, man. I can't be more grateful than that for that.
Exactly.
It's crazy. So, and I wanna throw in a little bit of nuance here too. Here we are in our heated apartment, living in America, saying, yeah, you should be grateful in spite of your suffering. Well, easy for us to say. Like, there's a danger in here that you can minimize the genuine suffering of people. And I'm not trying to do that, man. I'm really not. And if I come off that way, I apologize. That's not what I'm trying to do. People suffer in this world, and they suffer horribly, in unfair and unjust ways all the time. And don't get me wrong, you have plenty to be upset about. I mean, there are people that have plenty to be resentful about, plenty to be upset about, etc. And you can go down that road, and you might even be justified. You might. But the problem is that doesn't solve the problem. And there's no upside towards that attitude towards life and existence. You might be right on a fact-based level about how much suffering you have endured. But the response to that suffering, the response to how you live your life, that's what truly matters. And that decision we all have to make. And the point of the story is that it goes down to a fundamental level. So, yeah, no, it was an incredible lecture, and I think you summarized it well, and also specifically how it has impacted you.
Mm-hmm.
And good news is you keep me on my toes for being more grateful. So
heck yeah,
I get pretty cynical, but one other note here. We have the advantage of living in the greatest time in the history of humanity by far. And you did your episode on the 10 global trends. And I mean, if you want to know what I mean by living in the greatest time in the history of humanity, just go listen to that episode, because it is incalculable. It's one of my favorite lines. We have more fat people than starving people. We should be having a party every day in the street because of that. It's in the context of history, it's just absolutely absurd how good we have it on a material level. Now, this is important. On a material level, that does not mean that we are fundamentally well positioned on a religious, psychological, and value-based level. And in my opinion, those are far more important. So, materially, we have it immensely well. However, I think part of the thing he was trying to focus on at the beginning was that we're religiously in value and reality and truth, all those things we're confused about. And it isn't something that we should take lightly. And perhaps going to the most fundamental things, the most fundamental stories that undergird our culture, that undergird the values by which the Constitution was written, that perhaps is a place to start, and a place to not simply neglect as something that some religious people think is true. And we risk a dangerous level of ignorance by dismissing them. So,
oh yeah, all this religious stuff, it's a bunch of bunk that all the people a long time ago came up with. I don't need it now in my world where I can live my truth and I can do whatever I want. It's like, man, you are being willfully blind right now. Especially not looking into it at all is something that you're going to regret. By it would be religion and that dimension specifically, and the Bible maybe.
don't arrogantly dismiss it as some things that some stupid religious people thought at some time. That would be an error.
Yes, it would.
And that's a definite conclusion of his lecture. No doubt about it. And what's interesting for me, not that we need to talk too long about this, but I was arrogantly dismissing it as a bunch of, well, for lack of a better term, horse shit. And the redemption, is that the right word? The perspective shift, let's say redemption of the Bible and Christianity, etc. for me,
The meaning
was the meaning of it, truly, was spurred on by this exact line of thinking articulated by Peterson and other lectures for me. So, again, to reiterate, it just reached such a core level for me to hear him speak about that in person.
Yeah. Couldn't be more grateful.
Seriously. No, but yes, ha ha ha. But seriously,
No.
man. Oh, it's insane. It's surreal.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're grateful in spite of your suffering,
Mm-hmm.
there you have it.
Yep. One day we will chat with Peterson about it.
Yes, we will.
All right. I'd say that's a good episode right there.
I say we call it.
Yep.
I'm running out of brain.
Mm-hmm. Well done. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this episode. If you found this discussion meaningful or engaging, feel free to give me a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, comment on YouTube. Share this with your friends. If you found it meaningful, I'm sure they would too. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great rest of your day.